In what ways is Minnesota's natural environment described as being unique, special, or noteworthy in our materials from this week? A lot of people began with sort of the basic geology of the state. That Minnesota has some of the oldest rocks in the world, and a lot of its very active geological history is long in the past. So it's been a long time since it's been over any of those really large sort of fault lines in the Earth's crust, which has produced a lot of volcanic um, activity in the state. So what that means is that essentially the state has had a long time, or the area of Earth where the state's located has had a long time to be very weathered by just sort of natural wind and erosion and rain, by the glaciers, and all this has led to the state being pretty flat. Actually, not a lot of raised topography. The highest points in the state are really along sort of the Sawtooth Mountain regions, which used to be essentially higher than the Himalaya Mountains. It used to be absolutely massive mountain region, but that was millions and millions of years ago, and just through all that time, they have sort of worn down to sort of the small little mountain range that we see along the coast of Lake Superior today. So yeah, a very old sort of geological area that the state is now inhabiting. And of course, sort of one of the most recent geological features to think about is the role that glaciers played in forming the state. The most recent glaciation period ended about 10,000 years ago. That was the sort of retreat of the Wisconsin glaciers. And of course, the glaciers just sort of exacerbated that sort of flattening tendency. Essentially, they sort of acted like giant bulldozers that came down, and these giant ice walls that moved across the state, and actually dug a lot of sort of gouges and pits into the earth. And as those glaciers melted and retreated, it created really a lot of excess water that needed some place to go. So right immediately after the end of the glaciation period, you certainly see a ton of water trying to find a place to sort of make its way out towards the coastal region. So you have a gigantic lake that's formed, Lake Agassiz, and a huge river called the River Warren that essentially flows where the Minnesota River flows today, and then out south through the state, which was much larger than the Mississippi is today, absolutely huge. If you still go down to the Minnesota River Valley, you can see just how massively wide the valley is. The Minnesota River today is just kind of a very small river that runs through the middle of this much wider valley that you can really see just how huge the River Warren actually was. And ultimately, a lot of this water gets into those sort of gouges and pits that the glaciers had carved out, forming, many of the lakes that we are very much sort of well known for here in Minnesota today. So, well over 11,000 lakes in the state, and that is very much tied towards this period of glaciation as well. A lot of people also mentioned sort of the unique watershed that the state has. How the waters from Minnesota essentially sort of make their way out to almost all the adjoining oceans. For example, the Mississippi, of course, runs to the Gulf of Mexico. That's kind of the most obvious one. But the streams and rivers in the St. Lawrence River that empties into Lake Superior, eventually makes its way through the St. Lawrence Seaway all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean. And the Red River, of course, which runs north from Minnesota up into Canada, eventually comes out by Hudson Bay and empties into the Arctic Ocean. So using sort of the natural waterways in Minnesota, you can actually get a very long way, which is one of the reasons why eventually our state is going to be very prominent in the fur trade, because it is sort of a natural transportation avenue when the primary mode of transportation is boats and canoes and so forth. The next kind of geological feature that makes Minnesota unique is its sort of mixing of various weather systems. You have a lot of various weather patterns all coming to intermingle here in the state, which is one of the reasons why our state oftentimes has a high degree of variability in its temperatures. For example, it can be really warm one week and can be really cold another week. It gets very cold here in the winter, obviously, but can also get relatively very hot in the summer. So these sort of temperature extremes are partially due to these mixing weather systems. So you have the dry air coming off of the mountains and the Rocky Mountains blowing over the plains. You have warmer air coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, and of course you have much cooler air than being blown down from the Arctic and Canada. And as I said, sort of the big impact of this is the large degree of climate variability here in the state. It's not unheard of for the temperature in just a matter of a couple days to swing, 40, 50, sometimes 60 degrees. If you're talking about the spring or the fall, that has been known to happen. Which there's not too many places on Earth where you see that extreme of sort of temperature swings within so short of a time period, as well as the differences between, as I said, summer and winter. This is another reason why sort of one of the few natural disasters we have in the state are tornadoes, right? The sort of mixing of the cool air and the warm air is sort of the key components to creating volatile weather and tornadoes, and that's one of the reasons why that is sort of Minnesota is prone to having those occurrences. Another impact of these varying weather systems is that Minnesota is sort of divided up over three major biomes. Sort of think of it as sort of three very different areas where different plants and vegetation end up naturally occurring. So in the sort of southwestern portion of the state, it's much drier. It was part of sort of the Great Plains prairie system, which essentially extended from Minnesota all the way out to the Rocky Mountains. On the eastern portions of the state, you had these very sort of thick deciduous trees that were part of essentially a deciduous forest that before the large-scale sort of lumbering occurred in the United States, before contact of Europeans and so forth, stretched all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And in the northern portions of the state, it's sort of part of that great northern conifer forest, which extended far into Canada. So all these various vegetative regions were coming together in Minnesota and still compose it and comprise it to this day, even though there's, for example, much less prairie left than there used to be, and much less of that deciduous forest than there used to be. It's very much is still subject to those hallmarks of a very mixed climate and biological area. Also, a lot of people pointed out that Minnesota is the most northern state besides Alaska, so I guess that's something that we can brag about, and the highest of the sort of lower 48 states on the map. So certainly we have the reputation of being north and cold, which, as I said, true part of the year, but the northern part is definitely as well. We are here tickling Canada's belly. That's what we do. Describe your relationship to Minnesota's natural environment. What do you feel are the most significant ways that Minnesota's environment impacts you? And do you think this relationship is more similar or different from peoples of the past? Very good answers for this question across the board. And the area a lot of people sort of went to with their answers was looking at the various things that they enjoy taking advantage of in Minnesota's natural environment. Swimming and recreation and the multitude of lakes and rivers was a big one. Boating. Fishing, both ice fishing and fishing in a boat or from shore, was a big one. One of the sort of few areas where ice fishing is very popular. Some people who are not used to that kind of think that it's a particular cultural element of Minnesota. Hunting was another one that a lot of people brought up. Canoeing, hiking, and exploring some of Minnesota's 72 state parks. Going mushrooming, locating morel mushrooms, skiing or snowboarding in the winter. A lot of people realize that so much of Minnesota's sort of natural environment sort of dictates all the various things that they can sort of do to enjoy, interacting with nature across the state. For some people, it was much more closely tied than that. A lot of people sort of said they relied upon the natural environment for their livelihoods, or for their business, for their family owning a small business. People who are reliant upon farming and agriculture. Farmers very much are dependent upon the natural environment in the states. That was a good job that some people pointed out for that aspect as well. The ability to grow the crops and raise the animals here is very much dependent upon having a favorable climate for that. A lot of people touched upon sort of Minnesota's notorious winters. The travel issues with that, how we have to very much sort of have a wide arrangement of clothes in our wardrobes. The fact that we have to have, from heavy down coats all the way to, bikinis in the summer potentially, depending on how warm it gets. Once more, a lot of places don't necessarily need to have as wide a variety of clothing options because they don't have as wide a range of temperatures as our state has. So a good job sort of pointing that out. Someone also mentioned Minnesota's two seasons as winter and road construction, which I had to laugh at. I've certainly heard that before. And even the road construction element. Our climate being so variable and freezing and thawing is ultimately one of the things that's so hard on our roads here, and one of the reasons that you do have to have so much road construction during the summer and spring and sort of unfrozen months is because of our natural environment. So I thought it was very clever that some people pointed that out. A lot of people just sort of voiced that they had a very close personal connection to the land, that they felt like they were sort of stewards of the environment, that they were very sort of conscious about preserving the natural environment, removing invasive species, and so forth. So I thought everyone did a very good job sort of depicting how they felt very connected to the environment here in Minnesota. And there was a sort of a split upon how people sort of saw that relationship compared to peoples of the past. Some people definitely noted that it didn't seem on the surface that their survival necessarily depended upon the environment as closely as peoples in the past, which I think for a lot of people in their everyday lives is very true. We don't necessarily have to be as cognizant and aware of our natural surroundings for our survival as people in the past necessarily had to be. Some people sort of took this as saying that people sort of take the environment for granted, or the natural environment for granted these days, which I thought was an interesting way to think of it. And I think it's partially true, because even though we might not always be thinking about it, certainly the entire ability of our populations and sort of the world today to sustain the large population numbers we have is still 100% based upon agriculture, which is 100% based upon the natural environment, and that if for some reason a wrench gets thrown in there, it probably won't take a whole long time for us to start to once more realize just how dependent we are upon that natural environment. But sort of the ability to go grocery shopping and go to stores for most of sort of our goods and supplies that we need, for a lot of people, I think it does make that sort of separation. Not for everyone, but for a lot of people, realizing that they don't quite have the same or recognize the same sort of reliance upon the natural environment that, for example, the Dakota or Ojibwe peoples that we talked about this week might have experienced it. But a lot of people still felt a very close emotional relationship to the environment, and that it was still very much a part of them feeling tied to the land, tied to this particular place, and that it was a very, very sort of important part of who they were. And some people also voiced that they thought they had a less spiritual connection than people in the past. That because of that, perhaps because of that sort of reliance upon the land, that people in the past did have a much more sort of spiritual or religious connection to the natural environment itself. And while some people certainly express some ideas and elements of that, and certainly there are people within the population, and of course descendants of Ojibwe and Dakota people here today, who still maintain those very tight spiritual connections to the natural environment. I think a lot of people in the population probably do not think of it or conceive it in that same way. So it was very interesting to see kind of the similarities and differences that that the class picked out for this. Very good job on this question. There are many examples throughout the readings this week which describe the complex and technical understanding that the Ojibwe and Dakota had of their natural surroundings. I would like you to form a list of as many examples of how the Ojibwe and Dakota use their knowledge of the natural world to survive and thrive as you can. And the class did a very good job, I'd say, of pointing out how really the idea of seasonal subsistence became so important to the survival of the Ojibwe and the Dakota. Essentially, seasonal subsistence means that you are taking advantage of sort of what the environment provides you with and choose a life pattern and adopt a life pattern and a life way that sort of makes sense. So during the summer, when it's sort of ideal for agriculture, the Dakota and the Ojibwe would oftentimes form into larger villages and larger communities, tend the fields and bring in the harvest. In the winter, they'd break into smaller groups that relied more on sort of hunting wild game and traveling more often, which made more sense in that sort of environment. During the sort of the seasonal time periods, they could rely more on harvesting wild rice or natural berries, maple sugar. So definitely trying to think about what was going on in a particular season and trying to base your life around that. Of course, agriculture is going to be a big part of that. The growing of corn and beans and squash, maize is typically what the kind of corn or the original sort of corn that they were using at that point in time. And that's going to form the ability to really sort of grow pretty large population sizes and have several large villages and so forth, even though it didn't make sense to necessarily try to stay in those large villages year round, as we previously mentioned. But of course, that's supplemented with hunting and fishing, so having a detailed knowledge of the local game and their habits and the best way to track and hunt them becomes very important. I already mentioned taking advantage of sort of maple syrup and sugar. The harvesting of wild rice, fishing, weaving fish nets out of fibers, smoking the fish to preserve it. Flint mapping, making projectile points for hunting was a skill for a long time that was very essential. So knowing where to get that very good material for creating arrowheads and projectile points, knowing who had the good material, so who you could trade with in order to procure that was very, very important. Even the way that both these groups were living. Very much comes down to them utilizing their natural environment. You see the Dakota with their elm bark lodges for, their more permanent settlements, and then being able to break down into those sort of lighter weight teepees, which are more hide covered, when they wanted to do more traveling or hunting of buffalo and bison. And on the Ojibwe side, you see the utilization of those wigwams as sort of their main area to live, sort of the birch bark covered round domed structure. So the fact that they're able to provide shelter for themselves really comes down to being able to utilize that natural environment. Of course, the Ojibwe also use birch bark in their birch bark canoes. They use it before the introduction of goods from Eurasia, steel and metal goods. They use birch bark to create pots for boiling water. So finding all sorts of inventive ways to utilize the natural environment becomes very, very important. And of course, just down to your basic needs, clothing as well. Very much is something they're going to be utilizing. Deer skins, beaver hides, muskrat. These are all going to be used to create clothes to, as we know in Minnesota, find ways to keep warm along with the furs from those animals as well. So overall, very good job, and you can really see what a sophisticated understanding of the environment that both of these groups had to have in order to create such a sort of large thriving culture here in the state. Compare and contrast the two largest American Indian groups that came to live in Minnesota, the Dakota and the Ojibwe. In what ways were these groups similar? In what ways were they different? To begin with, they had sort of differing origin stories. They told sort of different stories about where they came from. The Dakota very much sort of viewed this land as the land that they had always occupied and always lived in. Their creation story centering around Lake Mille Lacs and thinking that this was kind of the area and the land that they were essentially created in. The Ojibwe, for their part, had a story of sort of prophecies that they had started in the more sort of eastern portion of the Great Lakes and had a prophecy that they needed to move until they found food that grew in water, which was sort of conceptualized to be wild rice. That they had then migrated until they sort of fulfilled this prophecy that their gods or the ancestors had relayed to them. So they kind of depicted themselves as coming from different locations. Based on sort of what we can tell from archaeology and so forth, Dakota seem to have occupied the region of northwest Wisconsin, and eventually sort of moved a little bit farther west into central and western Minnesota. And the Ojibwe spread from sort of the western or the eastern Great Lakes west into the Great Lakes, and eventually came to occupy more of the northern and eastern portions of our state. So they're eventually going to end up in generally different geographic regions. Of course, although there are going to be areas where there's a lot of interaction between the two groups, sometimes competition between the two, sometimes war between the two. Um, so that's some differences. Also, the way that they were living, people pointed out, kind of based on our last question there, the Dakota typically lived in those elm bark lodges or teepees when they were out on the Great Plains. The Ojibwe lived in the wigwams that were made of birch bark. The Ojibwe, sort of just based upon where they were located, had a little more access to deer and elk and moose. The Dakota had more access to the Great Plains and buffalo or the bison out there. Although both groups could, of course, would hunt a wide variety of these animals. And this is, to a large degree, sort of speaking in generalities. One big difference is going to be that the Ojibwe are the first to encounter French fur traders, which means that they are oftentimes going to sort of be the liaisons with the fur traders in the region, and they are going to have sort of an earlier access to those trade goods, whether it is metal cooking materials or firearms. Or clothing, before the Dakota have access to them. And eventually, as sort of tensions rise between the two groups, that's going to give the Ojibwe a certain degree of advantage in their military efforts. And one of the reasons why they are able to essentially start taking some land from the Dakota and pushing the Dakota farther south and west in the state. So that's going to be certainly going to be a difference. Also, you see both groups utilizing a lot of the same, like I said, sort of seasonal subsistence to survive, but to a certain degree it's varying over time depending on what locations in the state they are occupying. So maple sugar and wild rice, and the utilization of the maize, the squash, and the beans in order to survive. Certainly, some locations in the state are just sort of better for that large scale agriculture than others. For example, in the northern north eastern portion of the state, it has very rocky soils, which you can still grow things up there, but it's more difficult than, for example, sort of the central deciduous forest area where the soil is a little more well suited. So in that case, you saw the Dakota sometimes having sort of larger fields and being able to take advantage of that, even though the crops were available and utilized by both groups. And same thing as the Dakotas start getting pushed farther south and west, they're going to have less access to those sort of maple sugar producing trees. So it's going to mean that over time they're going to have sort of less access to that. But still, goods and natural environments that they're both sides are going to be, and both cultural groups are going to be utilizing. There's a lot of cultural similarities as well. People mentioned that there's really communities that were based upon kinship groups and a lot of respect between the varying family groups within these cultures. Extended family being sort of very important to both groups, as they're able to sort of trace their lineage and their kinship in a sort of very wide area, which created very much sort of extensive social and communal structures, within the tribes. Both the Ojibwe and Dakota are broken into sort of larger sort of subgroups within their cultural groups. And definitely a sort of large degree of sustained cultural interaction between both of them. Also, someone pointed out that they had similar practices for sort of raising their children, how the children were sort of raised by the community, and that allowed a lot of sort of freedom for the parents to be able to know that someone's always going to be there, sort of watching out for the children, their interests. So if they need to go off and hunt gather wild rice or something of that nature, that they know that children are going to be sort of very well looked after and taken care of. People also combined and compare the fact that the women in both groups seem to have a pretty high social standing, that they could at various times be leaders, that they could be running the household, that a lot of times sort of descendancy was traced through the female line, and that the women had a lot of just sort of general responsibilities, that they're very much helping out and responsible for the running of the society. So gathering woods, processing hides, farming, creating clothing, and really sort of being the central sort of keepers of their house, but having a lot of sort of autonomy and authority in doing so. And we'll sort of make the comparison between how sort of the women's roles in Dakota and Ojibwe culture versus European culture in the next question here. According to Priscilla Buffalo Head, what were some of the economic, social, and political roles of Ojibwe women? How and why were Ojibwe gender roles misinterpreted by early Europeans and modern historians? So this is a very interesting question, and I really like Buffalo Head's article here because she does a very good job of sort of breaking down definitely the sort of traditional gender roles within Ojibwe society, and how eventually those roles are perceived by a culture that is not its own, and how that sort of misperception was brought into a lot of sort of the early writings and depiction of Ojibwe gender roles by Europeans. So the idea of gender roles is essentially just that various genders have sort of different jobs to do within a society, or they do different tasks, and that's not unusual. Pretty much every culture on Earth has various gender roles that they try to ascribe to, but there's a very wide degree as far as sort of how strict cultures are in enforcing those gender roles or expecting people to follow those gender roles. But the idea of them just sort of existing is pretty universal. Also, there's a big comparison here between the ideas of kind of the public and domestic sphere, and how large of a degree a culture will try to separate those two. So the public sphere being things like participation in the economy, participation in politics or decision making for a group, participation in warfare, participation in religion. These are all examples of things that would fall under the public sphere. The domestic sphere then is things like raising children, keeping up a household, creating clothing and sort of the needs of that household. Those things all fall under the domestic sphere. So just like various cultures have various gender roles, they also have varying degrees to which they try to separate the public and the domestic spheres. So where do the Ojibwe fit into this? Well, the women traditionally in the Ojibwe culture very much had a lot of access to the public sphere, and that their gender roles, while defined, were fairly fluid. For example, they were very much sort of able and expected and to do manual labor, such as sort of harvesting the fields, building their wigwams, doing the cooking, making clothes, processing animal hides, collecting firewood. These are all sort of traditional things that women did in Ojibwe society, not to mention the fact that they sort of took the leading role in harvesting the wild rice as well as the maple syrup and maple sap collection. So those all sort of fit into that as well. There are some jobs though that women and men could do alongside each other. Crafting necessities like canoes, helping with hunting, as far as women scaring up game, and men sort of then started trying to kill the game, processing the game after the hunt. That was oftentimes done by both of these groups. Women in Ojibwe society also had a lot of economic power. That when they did come time to start trading with Europeans, that a lot of times it was women who were making these arrangements and these deals because they were the ones oftentimes processing the hides. They would then take it to the sort of the next step of being the ones who would try to negotiate and sell those hides. And this was very sort of startling to a lot of sort of the Europeans that they were coming in contact with, particularly the French and eventually the British, who had very different expectations for sort of the role that women are going to have within society. Europe being a much more sort of patriarchal society where there's a very strong and strict definition between the public and the domestic sphere. And in that way, women held a much lower status within Europe than they are here among the Ojibwe. So when the women are coming in and trying to negotiate and barter and sort of do things that they are only used to, certainly having men do within their society, or more typically having men do within their society, it does sort of come as a shock to them. In Ojibwe society, also women had the right to sort of manage their own household, sort of direct the family life. Like I said, a lot of them were matrilineal, meaning that they sort of trace descendancy through the female line. If they wanted if they were mad at someone and wanted them out of the house, they'd have the ability to do that. They had the ability to divorce and remarry pretty freely if they wanted to. And at various times, there's also evidence of Ojibwe women being, leaders within the community, political leaders, warriors within the community. Also, some of them were shamans or prophets, so fulfilling those religious roles. So you can see that while there were still gender roles in the Ojibwe society, there was a very small definition between sort of the public and domestic spheres, and that women could sort of move between those two very freely in Ojibwe society, where that was not the case in European society. European society, as I said, was much more segmented into men sort of being the realm of the public sphere and women being sort of relegated to the domestic sphere. So the end result of all this is that while those gender roles still existed, they were not as strict, and there was much less separation between those spheres for the Ojibwe women, and this ultimately led to women having a lot more prestige and privilege, access to power, and basic rights than you saw European women having at the same point in time. So how does this get translated then into sort of a historiography question, how we sort of interpret them? Well, a lot of the accounts of Ojibwe women that we get come from Europeans, and their perspective was that sort of these Ojibwe women were kind of slaves to their husbands, that they were sort of being taken advantage of, that they were being forced to do all this sort of hard work that they just sort of couldn't believe a woman was actually doing. And it was very sort of misconstrued and misinterpreted, as rather than having such a much more sort of egalitarian society, that it was almost a sort of a slave society that they were witnessing, which was not the case really in any way, shape, or form. Modern historians, a lot of times, because they were so reliant upon those writers from sort of eyewitness accounts and primary sources, which of course we have to work on, but they didn't do as good a job, like we talked about last week, of taking bias into account, and how maybe what the observers of Ojibwe women were writing about and documenting wasn't necessarily what they thought they were seeing, isn't what they were actually seeing. And interesting how going through and talking and bringing in more of that history and oral history and perspectives from the Ojibwe, as well as looking at other sources and other sources of documentation for this, ultimately paints a much different perspective and picture, where women are having a much higher status within society than those early European observers ever realized, and certainly something that modern historians now need to take into account. So it's a good lesson as well. And one of the things we sort of mentioned last week is how sort of history is changing and evolving as you bring in sort of more knowledge and more people into the process. And certainly it was very easy for people from the Ojibwe culture to look at these depictions and say, no, these are completely untrue. That's really not the way our society functions or works at all. And that now ultimately gives us a much better understanding of sort of the role that women played within Ojibwe society. And to a certain degree Dakota society as well, because a lot of the things that you could say here for the Ojibwe were very true of gender relations within the Dakota as well. Moving on to our document exercise and our Seth Eastman images. So how do these paintings depict the various ways the Ojibwe and Dakota interacted with their natural environment? And I really like this set of paintings because it very much shows evidence to that idea of subsistence, seasonal subsistence that we were talking about earlier, and how every sort of season had an activity that the Ojibwe or the Dakota could use to help themselves survive, to get things that just sort of taste good and makes their life worthwhile, and that they could really sort of use to make thriving, vibrant cultures and communities. You see sort of the depiction of agriculture with the women standing on those platforms and banging some pans to scare the birds away. The collection of wild rice, the making of maple syrup, as well as sort of the hunting, and how all of these are part of that kind of seasonal subsistence patterns that we have talked about. You can also see how the sort of basic things that they made their life out of, or made their sort of livelihood and survivability out of, the wood and the materials used to create their villages, the elm bark lodges that we see, the wigwams that we see, the skins and the clothes that they are wearing. Evidence of this as well. So really seeing how so much of the life of the Ojibwe and the Dakota were based upon utilizing their natural environment to sort of its fullest degree and its fullest extent. Going on to the second question here, what additional information about Ojibwe and Dakota culture can you find in these paintings? I thought someone brought up a really good point that they definitely show that these were sort of community-based activities and events, how there's lots of people in all of these various paintings and depictions, how things like wild rice gathering, hunting, the maple sugar, protecting the fields, they're all being done in groups. It's not just one person doing this. There's sort of the entire village or a large group of people within the village who are participating together to try to survive. Also, a lot of people said they saw evidence of those gender roles that Priscilla Buffalohead was talking about in her article, how it did seem like men and women were, working, and there was a lot of labor going on all their parts in order to sort of help the group survive. Also, a lot of people said you could kind of depict the time period, not just the fact that a European had been painting these, which of course would give you a pretty good idea of the range for the time period, but also the fact that there was a lot of evidence of the fur trade going on, and particularly the trade goods that American Indians would have been potentially receiving. Now we'll learn more about the fur trade next week, but for example that they have sort of metal pots and pans that they're able to utilize as an example of this. Some of the clothes they are wearing you can tell has been traded from Europeans to these groups. So you can see evidence that sort of places it in a specific time period here. Going on to number 3, based on what you know about the Ojibwe and Dakota, can you identify what groups are being depicted in each painting? And I thought this is kind of a cool question because you can kind of put on your detective hat and take what we learned throughout the week to try to tease this out. The first image of the village is certainly a Dakota village. You can tell by the elm bark lodges, which sort of make up the buildings there. So the fact that they're these sort of triangle kind of shaped, not really triangle, but like almost house shaped, with sort of the walls peeking into a roof made out of those sort of more solid planks. Those are elm bark lodges. So the architecture can kind of tell you that you're looking at a Dakota village. The second picture of sort of the women defending the fields is also going to be a Dakota village. You can tell because there's a teepee out in the background, and also that kind of agriculture was been more common for the Dakota than the Ojibwe, although the Ojibwe would have been doing a certain amount of it as well. But that particular one looks like it is depicting the Dakota. The third image of the maple syrup gathering was certainly the Ojibwe, because you can see the wigwams right in the back and the birch bark sort of covered structures that they are using. So once more, that's sort of your hint that you are looking at the Ojibwe. Number 4, the hunting scene. That could really be either one. Doesn't seem like there's enough evidence there, at least that I could see, to strongly depict one or the other. Some people mentioned that because it looked like they were using steel or iron spears or tools, that it might be the Ojibwe because they had sort of a earlier contact with fur traders where they could have gotten those materials. But the Dakota were eventually going to have those too. So I think it's pretty pretty hard to tell that one. And same way with the wild rice gathering. Some people thought that they were the birch bark canoes. Looking at the canoes, I couldn't really tell if they were made out of birch bark or not. And I didn't see enough signifying marks to say this is definitely birch bark on them. Because the birch bark canoes are actually pretty, you can tell that sort of birch pattern on them pretty easily. So I could say that could certainly be either the Dakota or the Ojibwe. But either way, as long as you sort of went through a process and explained how and why you came to your answers, you would have gotten full points for this. And I thought the class did a very good job trying to be detectives on this. So finally, what are some of the questions and complexities that arise when someone documents a culture not their own, and what kind of biases do you think might have influenced Eastman in his depictions of American Indians? So a lot of people do a good job of once more going back to last week's discussion about bias and just sort of pointing out that it's something that everyone's going to have, and no matter what you're creating, in some way, shape, or form, sort of your cultural perspective is going to be entered in there. So you might misinterpret what you were seeing and depict something differently than what's actually happening. Some people brought up sort of how the Europeans had misunderstood the role of Ojibwe women and maybe said, well, these might be depictions of them thinking how they're sort of being overworked when that might not necessarily be the case. Also, sort of choosing what to include and what to leave out can be a very important decision when you're going to be creating an artistic piece. And perhaps, there could be elements that Eastman just decided not to paint because he didn't think that they were important or relevant, which a Dakota or Ojibwe person would say, no, actually, that's very, very integral to this process, and you should very much sort of include that as well. But like I said, any author, Eastman would have been sort of subject to his own culture, his own history, his own religion, and certainly that's going to influence the way that he is looking at and thinking about and depicting, the Ojibwe. Some people pointed out that it seemed like he was very focused on sort of the different labors that they were doing, and survivability, and not necessarily looking at what are they doing on their leisure time or when they're relaxing and so forth. I thought that was sort of an interesting point that people brought up. And it's sort of one thing, and it seems like, despite having these, Eastman does more than some other artists at this point in time depicting American Indians. He does seem to be trying to create a very realistic scene of what he is seeing, but it's still something that we sort of as historians need to keep in mind, that there might not be a whole story that we are getting here. One thing I think is kind of interesting, and I'm not 100% sure if this is indicative of this bias or not, is that looking back at the pictures, you don't see a lot of individuals. You definitely see the Dakota and the Ojibwe being depicted as these sort of large sort of cultural groups, but if you look at the individual facial features, they're really non-existent. And I'm not sure if he would have depicted Europeans in the same way, if there would have been more details and so forth, but it seems like the people he's painting definitely seem like they are kind of an other to him. Like they are part of this sort of other culture which he is just observing, but doesn't have that sort of personal knowledge of enough to sort of put in some of those details that maybe a person of Ojibwe or Dakota culture, if they had been doing the painting, might have included. So I thought that was an interesting aspect that some of you picked up on. But overall, very good job thinking about these questions this week.